All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. And it's my pleasure to introduce today Professor Joseph Torigian from the American University and also a research fellow here at the Hoover. And most important, aside from his PhD in MIT, he's been at Stanford very often. I think this is the third tour of duty here, and always a pleasure to have him. And he's a very prolific scholar. Today he will talk about his first book about the succession struggles and power struggles in the Soviet Union and China. And when we talk about Joseph, we always have to talk about his next project, which is coming out in 2 weeks. And this will be a book on Xi's father. The party always comes first, if I remember correctly. A fantastic book that I'm in the middle of reading now. And it will be presented at the Hoover on June 3rd. Today he will talk about his book that came out 3 years ago, and we always have the pleasure of welcoming you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Let me first say that Amir is correct. I did a pre-doc and a postdoc at CSAC, which is here in FSI a few years ago, which is where I finished my dissertation, which is the book that I'm going to be talking about today. And there is a lot of Amir in the book. I was always surprised that he never came to me to ask for royalties, but he reacted to what was a very rough draft, and it ended up having a very big impact on the final product. It's also, on a personal note, very meaningful for me to give this book talk today and here at Stanford. As I said, I finished it here. And it might be the last book talk I give on this book because, as Amir said, my second book is coming out on June 3rd, which is a biography of Xi Jinping's father. So in a way, this is a goodbye to a book that I've been wrestling with in one way or another for maybe a decade or something like that. But because it is a book about succession, it is maybe a perennially useful subject to return to. And a good excuse for me to reread the book and remember what was in it. And some of it was pretty good, actually, although inevitably, as I talk about in the acknowledgments, when you do research on elite politics in China, it's a constant revision of the draft. And as Roderick McFarquhar, who's one of my advisors when I was doing the dissertation, said, on one occasion he was criticized by a party historian from China for getting something wrong, and McFarquhar's response was, of course I got it wrong, I didn't know that it happened. And he was just very open to changing his mind. So the book is about the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1957 and China from 1975 to 1981. And famously, these are the moments during which the Soviet Union and China faced the dilemma of succession politics. And the conventional view is that the post-Stalin and post-Mao transitions had a lot in common with each other, that there was this confrontation over economics and politics, and ultimately there was a triumph of the reformers over the conservatives or radicals, that the Stalinists were defeated by the anti-Stalinists and the Maoists were defeated by the anti-Maoists, and that the victories of Khrushchev and Deng were the result of the victory of inter-party democracy and collective leadership. And this historiography has a lot in common with the political science literature on how Leninist regimes work. And that's not surprising because a lot of that political science literature drew upon this period to theorize how politics work in authoritarian regimes. And so what is this conventional wisdom? I break it down into 3 ideas, and we can debate whether I do a good job of this or not. But I call it the economic model because they're all interrelated, and the big picture is they all understand politics as a system of exchange, a system of popularity. And the political science literature for Leninist regimes tends to argue that it's the leader who provides the best patronage model or popular policy platform that wins a power struggle. And second, that there's a defined group, usually described as a selectorate, that's enfranchised to choose the leader. There's a sort of a median voter within that group that makes the final decision. And finally, that the power ministries don't play an independent or unique role. So where Samuel Huntington in his work on Leninist regimes define them as one of their outstanding characteristics as very strong civil control over the military. So a lot of new evidence has come out that allows us to return to the succession period, and there are 4 chapters in the book. One chapter on the defeat of Beria, which I'm not going to talk a lot about today because I'm sure many of you have seen The Death of Stalin, which I refused to watch for a long time because I tend to prefer movies that take history seriously. That's also why I haven't seen Napoleon, because Ridley Scott said to people who criticized him, well, you weren't there, which I think is a very unserious way. But even though it takes liberties with the historical record, in some ways that movie does encapsulate some of the themes of my book that I'll talk about. The second chapter is about the so-called defeat of the anti-party group in 1957. You see those gentlemen circled here. Then 2 China chapters, one on the defeat of the Gang of Four in 1976, and then the gradual pushing out of Mao Zedong's initial successor, Hua Guofeng, between 1976 to 1981. And these cases tell a different story than the one that we used to think about. It's a story that's not so much about a politics of exchange, but a politics of personal prestige, historical antagonisms, backhanded political maneuvering, and a substantial role for the specialists in violence. Which means that 2 of the most important successions in the 20th century wasn't so much a victory of reformers over conservatives or radicals, as previous accounts have suggested, but a settling of scores. So to summarize what I'm going to be arguing today, this is the most important slide if you want to just take your lunch and leave, but that's the main reason you're here, is that it was more about personal prestige and compromising material than the dispensation of patronage or real policy differences. And that it was the manipulation of ambiguous rules that was more important than canvassing for votes within a defined group. And finally, that the power ministries, the military and the political police, again, I don't say secret police because Amir told me I should call them the political police, that's another impact of him on the book, have an outsized effect on the outcome. So I'm not sure what the makeup of this room is in terms of historians versus political scientists, but to make a theoretical argument like the one that I just made raises methodological questions. How you make a case like that, how you proceed. And so this is a little bit different from the political science that is taught in this building, which tends to focus more on a quantitative approach, but it's still necessary to be rigorous with the evidence. And the question becomes, how do you do that? So what I did was, I asked questions of the empirics that could be answered, yes or no, that had theoretical implications for how we think about the nature of politics. And I broke those questions down into 3 groups. And the first question is about what they were fighting over. So how do we address this? Well, I asked 3 questions. The first was about political style. Did the winner have a leadership style that was unambiguously more prone to consensus, collective leadership, and co-optation than that of the losers? Again, you can look in the evidence and see whether this is true or not. You can see how the answer would have theoretical implications. The second was whether policy differences were real, or whether alleged differences were manipulated and overblown for the purposes of political struggle. And third, to what extent did the outcome revolve around personal prestige, historical antagonisms, and the threat of compromising material? So all of these are questions about what they were fighting over. The second questions are about who decides who wins. I asked, was there a serious deliberation about the strengths and weaknesses of a competitor, or did the winners conduct discussions in an unfair, conspiratorial spirit and present the decision as a fait accompli? Second, were the winners defined by a power struggle within a single group, or which group was empowered to determine the winner? So in other words, was it there was a single set of people who made the decision, or was the axis which potential group within the elite was enfranchised to make the decision? And finally, to what extent did the winners violate even ambiguous rules? So that's who decides. And the third is who enforces the rules, and this is of course about the power ministries. I asked, did leaders consider the power ministries to be irrelevant to struggles within the party, as Huntington would expect, or did they consider control over the coercive organs to be essential? And second, when members of the power ministries expressed an opinion on the power struggle, was the effect equivalent to their voting power, or did their positions threaten the potential use of force and therefore have an outsized effect? So there's a debate between Andrew Nathan and Joseph Smith about institutionalization in the People's Republic of China. And Andrew Nathan famously said, the reason China proved resilient after June 4 was they did institutionalize. Joseph Smith says there's no institutionalization whatsoever. I have somewhat, I think, of a Goldilocks position on this question, which isn't to say that there weren't any rules at all. They weren't shooting at each other at Politburo meetings. But it was still a brutal struggle. So I characterize this as a knife fight with weird rules. There were some limitations on contestation that were meaningful. And this actually is where a lot of what Amir comes out in the book, because he thinks a lot about ideology and cares a lot about ideology as an institution. And I think it's hard maybe for people to think about the political culture in this kind of organization, because it's an organizational weapon, as Philip Selznick of the RAND Corporation called it, which meant that it is extremely leader-friendly, but it also means that people are dedicated to it. There is a real emotional attachment to this organization as a manifestation of a world historical force, which means that people continue to believe in the party in a way that's very important, even when they're on the losing side. So what this means is 4 different things. The first is that the competitors will go to great lengths to present their victories as legitimately as possible. They want people to think that they are serving even the most ambiguous rules within the parties. Second, they don't resort to any more force than necessary. So they think about, well, should we just arrest them? Should we use a meeting? Should we use the Central Committee? And these have various levels of legitimacy, but also various levels of riskiness. So when they calculate how to move forward, they try not to do anything more obviously a violation than they need to. The third is that the losers don't tend to defect. So when you lose in a party struggle in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the 1950s, in the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, you care a lot about yourself, but you care more about the party, because the party always comes first. The party's interests come first, which is the title of my second book. Which means that you hope that later on the party will change your mind and rehabilitate you, but you recognize that resisting the party means resisting the organization that was the central source of meaning in your entire life. And also there's an understanding that it will just make the situation worse for you, and potentially worse for the party, and worse for anybody else that you try to drag into it, because then you're a faction, and that's a really dangerous charge to face. And finally, looking at the military and the political police, they're important, but they're not everything. They're kind of like a vampire, right, where they can't come in unless they're invited, but once they're invited in during a moment of contestation, they can really, really, really matter and do a lot of damage. So what tends to happen is, it's not the military against the party, but competitors within the party trying to use their special relationship with the military and the political police in a way that helps them defeat their opponents, which is really important because it's ultimately the military who gets to decide which of these various potential interpretations of the rules is the one that they're actually going to enforce. So I'm going to talk a little bit about primary sources. The slides that I prepared are about China. People tend a little bit to be more interested in China because the People's Republic of China still exists, and the Soviet Union does not. But if people are interested in me talking about Soviet sources as well, I'm happy to do that. I know this is a joint event of the Center for East Asian Studies and CREEES. It's not easy to study China, folks. I'm not going to lie to you. We have a leader in China right now who has said that the reason the Soviet Union collapsed is they lost control of their history. So Xi Jinping believes that if you don't have idealism, if you don't have motivation, if you don't believe in the party, the game is up. And one of the easiest ways to convince people that the party doesn't deserve your respect is to suggest that the party isn't always right, and to point to the darker corners of the Chinese Communist Party's past. So Xi Jinping calls this historical nihilism. It's why you may have heard of the Li Rui diaries at the Hoover Institution, which are really kind of a watershed moment in the study of Chinese politics, but that the Chinese government has not been very happy about. You may have heard of this lawsuit. So it's not easy, but counterintuitively, maybe very counterintuitively, it's a very exciting moment to be doing research on China, because the amount of resources that are now available is way beyond what people are actually using. So the one collection in the upper left corner, Stanford has a pretty good collection, but not a full collection of them. It's colloquially known as the LA collection because it's this sort of clearinghouse in Los Angeles, so it's a little mysterious. But they have been selling hundreds, maybe thousands of internally circulated or, in fact, classified materials to American universities all over the world. And it's probably like that entire wall, and then maybe a big chunk of this wall, floor to ceiling. Really an amazing collection. During the Cultural Revolution database, they lost a lot of control over their documents and archives, and those were smuggled out, and a lot of them are available in places like the Chinese Cultural Revolution database. That actually, by the way, goes even into the 1940s, into the 1980s, that's what it's called. And then there's the Maoist Legacy database at the University of Freiburg. Then there's the which is like an internally circulated party history journal for various regions and institutes, which you can, actually Berkeley has an almost entire set if you want to head over there. But they're also at various other universities as well. The Confucius.net, this was an online bookstore in China where often you could buy a lot of things. And now that the de minimis rule doesn't work anymore because of the tariff war, it may be a little bit harder to buy these kinds of books, but still you can find really extraordinary material just Googling a name that you haven't seen before or an institution that you haven't seen before, including documents. And then in Hong Kong, there were all of these books that were published outside of mainland censorship. Some really high quality histories by historians within the system who had access to materials that other people don't, and then they go and publish in Hong Kong. And then a lot of memoir literature. So in the middle, that's a picture of Deng Lixun, who was a famous party politician during the 1980s, usually seen as a leftist and conservative. He published his memoirs in Hong Kong. And the daughter of Hu Yaobang, general secretary for much of the 1980s, she also published in Hong Kong with a lot of new details about her family. And then even party history journals within China, there was a period, maybe until about 2015, where they were really pushing the envelope, and you could get really high quality stuff on everything from Tiananmen Square, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. And it's kind of a little fishy to use online databases now. There's some weird things happening to them. But most universities are buying physical media too, so you can still access them. I recommend that's what you do with this kind of stuff. So what does all of this evidence tell us? Well, I'll talk a little bit about the Gang of Four, and then I'll talk about Hua Guofeng, and then I'll conclude. And if people want to talk more about the two Soviet cases, I'm happy to do that. So probably a lot of people have heard of the Gang of Four, and if I asked you what you knew about them, you might say things like you had heard that they were a very tightly knit group, that they were very radical, that they were exclusionary, that they were aggressive. But today I want to tell a slightly different story about them, which is that they did combine aggressive tactics with something else, which was a desire to coexist with other members within the leadership, and that policy inclinations that were somewhat different from others, those differences were not fundamental, and the gang did not have their own coherent policy platform, and that the gang's most serious problems, the main reason they were unpopular, were historical, by which I mean a lack of major accomplishments from before 1949, and an association with the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1968, when the violence was the worst. And that the gang were unexpectedly arrested instead of being openly confronted at a Politburo or a Central Committee meeting, because those options were seen as too dangerous because there was so much support for the Gang of Four in those institutions. So let me show you some evidence that is a little bit surprising. This, of course, is Jiang Qing, Mao's wife. We tend to think of her as a very radical person, very extreme person. She made this comment, this is from the Cultural Revolution database, by the way. She made this comment near the end of the Cultural Revolution. She says, our chairman, meaning Mao, of course, said that 70% of the Cultural Revolution was good and 30% was bad. I will think more about the 30%, meaning the bad. You, comrades who were attacked, should think more about the 70%, meaning the good. With regard to the 30%, originally I had thought it simply was not my fault. So this is Jiang Qing saying that the worst violence of the Cultural Revolution had nothing to do with her. She's not taking credit for it, she's not taking pride in it. She's saying she had nothing to do with it. She says, knocking down everything, doubting everything, I sent Chairman Mao a report about that. Those were the ideas of Tao Zhu. someone else. She's trying to distance herself from these abuses. She said, I simply had nothing to do with all-out civil war. After the chairman's analysis, I then thought that even though it was not my fault, it had occurred during the Cultural Revolution. I was first vice head of the Central Cultural Revolution group, so it was necessary to think about the experiences and lessons. So it's not my fault, but I'm still going to do a self-criticism. It's clearly an olive branch to the old revolutionaries by talking in this way, right? So this is Zhang Chunxiao. He is typically seen as the brains behind the operation, the pen, the intellectual. So focusing on what he thought is really important here. And when you look at what he said, there are certainly things that were very radical, but to essentialize him as a radical is somewhat problematic. Let's look at this particular quote, saying, when we are criticizing the mistake of using production to suppress politics, hatters absolutely must not give, because of this, give up on production. He knew that if he couldn't get the economy to work, it was still bad for him. Still bad for the Gang of Four. He wasn't so stupid to think otherwise. But the more important thing here is how Zhang Chunxiao thought about himself and his role within the party. This was not someone who had his own思想, his own ideology. This was someone who considered himself nothing more than the secretary to Mao Zedong. He saw himself as someone whose job was to intuit what the chairman wanted and then write things that the chairman liked so that he could move up the ranks, because Mao decided that he understood what Mao wanted better than anyone else. This is not a story, folks, of Zhang Chunxiao saying, I want to be a radical, I want to push for a radical agenda. He said on one occasion, I do not say anything the chairman does not tell me to say. If the chairman doesn't tell me to move, I don't move. Okay, so then what was the problem then, right? So yeah, there were some policy differences. I don't want to say that there weren't any. But at the same time, they didn't have their own coherent policy platform. They were reaching out to the other old revolutionaries. In some ways, they could be practical. The real problem for them was this issue of historical antagonisms and prestige and status within the party. Because in the Chinese Communist Party, whether you had authority, whether people respected you, was about when you joined the revolution, what you did during the revolution, your hierarchy during the revolution, whether you were able to achieve victories despite overwhelming odds, which base area you created, which field army you commanded. That was the real capital, right? So the Gang of Four, these were not those kinds of people, right? They all had things from their past that were very dangerous. Jiang Qing, when she married Mao, a lot of the old revolutionaries were very unhappy about that. Why? Because she was an actor from Shanghai, which was, in this very masculine, chauvinistic organization, something that they didn't like. So how were these people targeted? So on the left, that's Hua Guofeng, and on the right, that's Ye Jianning. So Hua Guofeng was Mao's successor. Hua Guofeng was Mao's successor, and Ye Jianning was the most senior person within the People's Liberation Army. So they're trying to figure out what to do about the Gang of Four. And in fact, it took a long time for Ye Jianning to trust Hua Guofeng. He thought that Hua Guofeng was just like the Gang of Four, which shows just how hard it is to figure out what other people are all about, right? Because Hua Guofeng, he benefited from the Cultural Revolution, so there's a lot of doubts about him, which I'll get into more in a moment. But think about the problem they faced. 2 members of the 4-member Politburo Standing Committee were members of the Gang of Four. Things looked a little bit better for the conspirators on the Politburo, but the Central Committee was iffy, right? So when they were thinking about having a Politburo meeting, they were afraid that the Central Committee would rally and help the Gang of Four. Now, what's really interesting is why they had this fear. Why they had this fear can be sourced in my chapter on 1957 in the Soviet Union. What happened in the Soviet Union in 1957? A majority of the Presidium, which is what they called the Politburo at that time, wanted to get rid of Khrushchev. They thought that Khrushchev was a dictator, which is something they didn't want anymore, especially after Stalin. So they tried to move against him. But what did Khrushchev do? He played for time, and he was able to engineer a full Central Committee plenum that overturned the Presidium's decision. So explicitly, the conspirators in China in 1976, when they moved against the Gang of Four, they said, We don't want what happened in the Soviet Union in 1957 to happen in China in 1976. We need to just arrest them. We can't use what they call the meeting solution. So when the Gang of Four was arrested, they were stunned. They actually didn't think that the conspirators would be that daring, that they would move that fast, but they did anyways. Right? So let's talk about Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng is probably not as famous as the Gang of Four, not as dramatic as Jiang Qing, but he was the successor to Mao Zedong. And people, even now, often think of him as kind of a joke. They think of him as someone who was kind of Mao-light. But I think it's really important to talk about Hua Guofeng for a couple of reasons. One is that almost universally, when you read about China's reforms, you hear something like Deng Xiaoping started reform in 1978. And you also hear Deng Xiaoping emerged victorious in 1978 because he was the most popular and it was a victory of inter-party democracy. You see, when you read almost any article about China that talks about history, you see these claims. The story of Hua Guofeng that has emerged from the new documents says that both of those claims are heavily overstated. So this idea that Hua Guofeng was a dogmatist, that he was sort of a light version of Mao, that he had his own faction, that he was trying to prevent the old revolutionaries from returning to power, none of those things have proven to be true. And that the evidence suggests a very different story, which is that in fact he was quite popular in many circles, that he didn't have his own faction, that he wanted to work with the old revolutionaries, and that he deserves the credit for starting reform and not Deng. So those of you who have studied Chinese history might say, okay, what about the two whatevers? What are the two whatevers? Sorry for the jargon, the communist jargon. I guess if you're here, maybe that's what you like. The two whatevers was this formulation that appeared in 1977 that when you read it on first glance, it looks like Hua Guofeng is making a policy declaration. He's announcing his program. And that essentially, it sounded like, if you just read the words, if you didn't parse the words, that the Cultural Revolution wasn't going to be over and he was going to do everything the same way that Mao did. And that he was saying this to justify not allowing people like Deng Xiaoping and the other old revolutionaries to return to power. But what does the evidence show? Well, the evidence shows that Hua Guofeng had already told Deng Xiaoping that he was going to return to power even before this. And that in many ways, Hua Guofeng was already seriously thinking about how to save the revolution because he saw how bad things were. And he was afraid of a total economic collapse and that the party's existence itself was in danger. The problem for Hua Guofeng was how you figure out moving to a new model, but not moving so quickly that the cart turns over. So his thinking was that what we'll do is rally to Mao's memory to move away from Mao in practice. So this phrase was an unfortunate, poorly expressed attempt to square that circle that was widely misinterpreted within the elite and even still in many history books about China. In fact, in 1978, at the work conference, the famous work conference, Hua said, I didn't consider these two expressions completely enough. Reflecting now, if only I hadn't raised the two whatevers, things would have been fine. This is an interesting picture. Does anybody know who that is standing in the middle? That's Xi Jinping's father. This is Deng Xiaoping. That's Ye Jianming, remember him from an earlier slide? 1978 to 1980, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, is the party boss of Guangdong. While he was there, the special economic zones were born. This was a painting that was introduced a few years ago at a museum in Beijing that shows Xi Zhongxun, father of Xi Jinping, pointing to the special economic zones that he's proposing, and then Deng giving the imprimatur and saying, I approve this idea. This is a fabrication of what the historical record actually was. The work conference in 1979 that this is supposed to represent was run by Hua Guofeng, and Deng Xiaoping was not even there for most of it. We have from the Guangdong archives, Xi Zhongxun returning to Guangdong after this meeting, and who did he talk about? Who is he thankful to? Hua Guofeng, not Deng Xiaoping. In fact, in 1995, when Xi Zhongxun is living in Guangdong, Hua Guofeng wants to visit him. And at first they don't let Hua do it. And then he presses and finally Hua meets him and Xi Zhongxun says, people are saying that I'm crazy because I said that you deserve credit for the special economic zones. The Li Rui diaries, there's a very interesting quote in there. Xi Zhongxun telling Li Rui, we shouldn't give all of the credit to Deng Xiaoping. That's the special economic zones. All right, another slogan, guys, sorry. Practice is the sole criterion of truth. So this was a slogan that appeared in 1978. And we used to think that Hua Guofeng didn't like it, and that he tried to quash it. And because of that, he was removed from power at the end of the year. The real story is that the people who first introduced this phrase had no clue whatsoever that it would ever turn into a policy wedge issue. They thought it was common sense. They thought it was like just a normal way of talking about the world to justify the direction the party was moving in. A man named Wang Dongxing, who was in charge of propaganda, hated it and criticized these people, which really made them angry. But they were stunned that Wang Dongxing had a problem with this, right? Hua Guofeng is someone who is more democratically oriented, more consensus focused. He's letting the debate just kind of continue because he doesn't want to end it. He thinks that it's okay for this kind of conversation to happen. On the eve of the third plenum, this moment where allegedly Hua Guofeng is defeated for opposing this more practical viewpoint, Hu Yaobang goes home and he says this to his family about the third plenum, the big breakthrough, right? Hua Guofeng, in one swipe of the pickaxe, broke a hole in the dike. Just how big the flow of history will make that hole is completely up to the power of the people. Hua Guofeng, not Deng Xiaoping. Let me move to this. So this is a speech that Deng Xiaoping gave in August of 1980, in which he criticizes feudalism, and he calls for inter-party democracy and institutions. For decades, people have pointed to this to say that this was Deng Xiaoping expressing his sincere hope to move away from the strongman rule of the Mao era. But if we look at the historic context of that time, and also what other people later said about the speech, we realize that he didn't quite really mean what he was saying. And that what had happened was Hua Guofeng had made a statement that some people concluded meant that he was trying to make inroads with the military, which Deng saw as his bailiwick. And then Deng decided that was when Hua really needed to go, and also needed to be tarnished. And so he needed a wedge issue, he needed an expression, he needed something to justify this move against Hua Guofeng, so he talked about being anti-feudal. And of course, Hua was picked by Mao, which is kind of a feudal thing, right? Both Deng Liqun, remember I showed you his memoirs earlier, as well as Zhao Ziyang, the general secretary in 1989 during the student protests, people asked them later, if Deng made this speech, then why didn't he later actually really achieve institutionalization within the party? And both of them gave the same answer, which was, oh, that was just about Hua Guofeng. Deng didn't really care about that. So this is both like an interesting empirical, historical anecdote, but also raises questions about the use of political language and how it's interpreted by people on the outside too. So how did they get rid of Hua Guofeng? What were his weaknesses? This is a very interesting picture. This shows Hua Guofeng, along with members of the Gang of Four, at Mao's corpse. It was used as compromising material against him to suggest that he was closer to the Gang of Four. When this picture was taken, he was already plotting with Ye Jianning the destruction of the Gang of Four. The issue with Hua Guofeng was that he had none of the kind of revolutionary status and prestige that people like Deng Xiaoping and Chun Yun had. And in a system where hierarchy means everything, that was a big problem. But also the Cultural Revolution was very complicated. It was very messy. So it was really hard to distinguish who were the reform-oriented individuals who saw a natural condominium with the old revolutionaries like Hua Guofeng, and the people like the Gang of Four, who I already told you are also more complicated than we used to think. So it was easy to tarnish him. And, these old revolutionaries, they hated the Cultural Revolution so much because it reversed those status hierarchies. And then after Mao died, they reasserted themselves. And that was the story of the rise of Deng Xiaoping. But again, that doesn't really, not a good story to tell. So what was the story Deng Xiaoping told? That Hua was a radical, a Maoist, didn't want to get along with the old revolutionaries. Made it look nicer than it really was. And people bought it. And that's often what people still think happened with Hua Guofeng. So just to conclude, what does this mean for how we think about China and politics? Well, some people hope for another third plenum, meaning they hope for an elite revolt that forces Xi Jinping onto another path because he's failing. So there was recently an article in Foreign Affairs about how much China changes over time and what kind of mechanisms might trigger another change within China. So people talk about this quite commonly. But I think that with the revision of the third plenum historiography, it's just yet another illustration of how leader-friendly Leninist systems are. And that policy differences don't really determine the outcome of polite contestation. So this idea that Xi Jinping needs to account for different views within the party, or that he's afraid of different views within the party. Xi Jinping believes that his system is better than the American system because it's centralized and they have a core that can make decisions that are unpopular, which is different from what he thinks goes on in the United States explicitly. He says capital runs the United States, which is why in the United States there is material wealth but spiritual poverty, and why the American government engages in gambling, aggressive foreign policy, as opposed to China, where because he is able to understand the entire interests of the country and force unpopular decisions, including during the tariff war, is what makes their system special. So in that sense, when it comes to Deng Xiaoping, I think that there are more continuities with them than people think, because they never actually were able to overcome the tragedy of the Mao era and escape the strongman leader model. And that in some ways, Xi Jinping, by actually having Politburo Standing Committee meetings on a regular basis, Politburo meetings, which isn't something that happened during the Deng era because Deng didn't want to give other people a chance to disagree with them, it's actually more institutionalized than during the Deng period, which is different from how many people characterize it. And so I just hit time, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we are open for questions. Sure, please.
Really fascinating talk, thank you very much. Can I press you to move on from exactly where you stopped? Looking ahead, you yourself reminded us recently that Putin is 72 years old, and Mao will be 72, Xi will be 72 years old in less than a month. So, given what you've said about the leader-friendly nature of Leninist regimes, the note you ended on, how should we think about the future in both places?
Succession politics is really hard to get right. In fact, it's kind of the third rail of Leninist systems. And the North Koreans even have noted in some of their propaganda that Marx and Engels never solved the problem of socialism, so it was up to them and other socialists to figure out what to do. And if you look at Soviet history, Stalin told his circle that after he died, the imperialists would strangle them like kittens. And after Stalin's death, of course, you have Khrushchev come to power, the 20th Party Congress, in which this speech in which he criticizes Stalin is made. Mao Zedong concludes from this that it's possible for a communist state to go bad, to go revisionist. And so he's looking at the people around him, and because he's delegating power, because he thinks that Liu Shaoqi is going to be the successor, they have some policy space, but they keep getting it wrong. Not because they oppose Mao, but because Mao is mercurial and changes his mind and sometimes doesn't want to be read so that he can figure out whether people can guess what he really thinks. And so to solve that problem, we had the Cultural Revolution, which was about getting rid of the people he thought were revisionists and empowering the people that he thought would keep China on the path that he determined, which actually accelerated forces within society that after his death moved China in a new direction. The story of Xi is especially interesting here because his father, Xi Zhongxun, was the right-hand man to Zhou Enlai during the 1950s and early 1960s, and Xi Zhongxun was the right-hand man to Hu Yaobang in the 1980s, which meant that his father was the chief deputy to the chief deputy, or one of the chief deputies twice. And what did he witness? Well, he witnessed both Mao and then Deng not trusting their deputies, not trusting their named successors. And because of that, this constant turmoil, Mao getting rid of several successors, Deng getting rid of Fa Guofeng, and then Hu Yaobang, and then Zhao Ziyang, and then narrowly Jiang Zemin. So how do you stop this from happening? Well, I think one of Xi Jinping's answers is quite clear and simple, which is, well, if successions are dangerous, then we're not going to have a succession. And in fact, people surrounding him have said that the imperialists who want peaceful evolution, the von Schacks of the world, Amir, they place their bets on succession. That's what the imperialists do, because it's so hard to make sure that you hand it off to the right person. So you want to delay it, but then what do you do next, right? So Xi Jinping saw how this two-line system of a leader and a deputy was really dangerous, especially because it made the succession issue even more hard to get right because people were losing the trust of their leader. So he doesn't want to have two headquarters within the party, which means that, well, how do you pick a person to test them as a successor, right? If that's so destabilizing. He's probably changing his mind. He's probably thinking through things. He's probably testing people. He sees who can read him, who's good at their job, who's tough, who he thinks will keep that legacy going. But he's also old, right? And for someone like him who really cares about the party, he probably doesn't want to leave it in the worst place he found it. So he has to think about the succession. But how do you do that handoff? It's a dilemma he can think about how to manage, but there's no clear way of solving the problem. So in that sense, I think succession politics are going to be really interesting to watch in China over the next few years.
If I may ask, back to our Soviets, and the one who is not in your book, but is hovering all over, Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Gorbachev comes to power, and the succession is exactly within your paradigm of power, prestige, settling scores, getting rid of everyone else, etc. And then a year and a half into his domain, he starts overhauling the system, which comes down. How does he fit?
Yeah, Gorbachev is really interesting. So the story of Gorbachev's rise to power has a lot to do with Andropov, a friend of yours, Amir. And so the question is why Andropov liked Gorbachev, why he promoted Gorbachev. And so Gorbachev in his memoirs, he talks a lot about his relationship with Andropov, and he says that they used to like cook shashlik together and sing to each other and this kind of thing. And then Gorbachev is brought to the capital, and Gorbachev says to Andropov, "Would you like to have dinner with me?" And Andropov says, "You don't understand politics in the party center. We have dinner with each other." Immediately Brezhnev is going to know exactly what he said, and he's going to worry about it. And Gorbachev says there was a lack of normal human nature within the center. So people weren't really talking to each other. They didn't really understand each other. And then in 1985, when Gorbachev was selected, of course there's questions about whether he was inevitable or Grecian was a serious successor. When you read Gorbachev's opening remarks at the Politburo and the Central Committee Plenum, there is no sign whatsoever that he is going to go in the direction that he did. And in fact, if you look at the Politburo documents which have been declassified up until Gorbachev was elected, he's actually quite quiet. And when he does speak, he can come off as a conservative, like when the Korean plane was shot down. It wasn't a self-reflective response to that, right? So in that sense, I think Gorbachev was seen as someone with a vigor and youthfulness, but they didn't know who they were getting. And for reasons I just said, in a leader-friendly system, if you pick someone you don't know who you're getting, they have a huge amount of leeway. So I think that what's interesting about Gorbachev isn't that they turned against him because he went so far, it's how far he got before they moved against him, and why they moved against him when they did. So if you read, for example, Sergei Plokh's book on the collapse of the Soviet Union, you see that the reason they moved against Gorbachev wasn't so much about policy differences, but that they thought he was coming for them first, which is exactly, by the way, what happened in 1964 when Khrushchev was removed from power. I have an article in Journal of Cold War Studies about this. which is you can get to a point where the people around you are so afraid of you that even though it's a leader-friendly system, you feel that you need to go for broke and you need to take a big risk. And when they did in the case of Gorbachev, they lost. They weren't able to emerge victorious. And it's interesting too, if you read like Vadim Medvedev and Chernyayev, they were saying that Gorbachev didn't fully understand the nature of how much power he had. And part of that was a misunderstanding of what happened to Khrushchev, that he did think the Central Committee was a bigger danger to Khrushchev than it really was. And then if Gorbachev had moved with more forcefulness, then maybe we would have seen a different outcome. But again, like the fact that Andropov picked Gorbachev is really so interesting, right? And I'm sure when we think about how people in China might think about succession politics, it's just so hard to read someone that might be the person that you pick, right? Because maybe they were hiding what they were doing, maybe they themselves changed. There's a very funny comment actually by Mao Zedong in 1968, where it's almost a completely different Central Committee because so many of them had been purged. And he said, all of you were shouting in support of the Cultural Revolution 2 years ago, but now that so many of you are gone, it shows that you actually didn't really understand the Cultural Revolution because you were just defeated by it. He's like, I know better, right? So then like, you can see how this is just like a disaster for succession politics because he's just so, he knows that you're going to pretend that you do what he wants you to do, but he's going to be looking for any evidence that you're not. And so it's just really, really a toxic mix of in terms of the political atmosphere. Yes.
Do you, now, I'm going to ask you to speculate. Putin is no longer claims himself to be head of the Communist Party, but he grew up in that system. But speculate on how the, not people, but a process that Putin must be thinking about this. Doesn't sound like he can trust, if I were him, I wouldn't trust anybody.
Yeah. So in some ways, I think the Chinese succession is more stable because of the Politburo and the Central Committee. And people have done work to say what the Constitution might mean for a power struggle after Putin's death, but it's very unclear, right? What I think Putin is trying to do on a larger level is a little bit similar to Mao and a little bit similar to what Xi Jinping is doing, which is how you engineer society in a way that it doesn't change after you die. And part of that is succession politics at the very top, but it's also about society as a whole, right? So Vladimir Putin, actually I think about Amir when I think about this topic all the time because of his book on the militarization of the Soviet Union after World War II and the role of the Fronteniki. And what Vladimir Putin now seems to be doing is something a little bit similar, which is to have this vision of Russian history that during World War II, the Nazis were defeated but not eliminated. And the war right now is the latest round, right? And to make sure that Russia can continue to fight round after round and be this force for good in the world, to defeat hegemonism, then you need to inoculate Russian society against Western values. And the war is helping him do that, I think, in his mind, because you have this idea of the time of heroes, it's not a perfect program, a lot of people make fun of it, but you're promoting people who fought on the front that you think are loyal to the regime, patriotic education. There's actually been a lot of really good articles in like the Journal, the Post, and the Times about patriotic education in Russia and how it's trying to create a whole new generation of Russians who are on board with the future that Putin has selected. But then the question becomes, can you go too far, and can by fighting a war and having this ham-handed propaganda really win people over, or are you actually mortgaging your future in a way that actually will accelerate changes after your death because it creates all of these problems in society that are insurmountable, right? So you look at Russia, right? I mean, I don't know if young people are want to go on this merry-go-round of the perpetual war against the West or not. I don't know if people who want to make money in Russia love this idea of this constant battle against peaceful evolution. And the economy is really in a lot of trouble too, right? So I think Putin wants to ensure that an authoritarian superpower or pole continues after his death. But how you do that on a societal level and how you do that at an elite successor level is really hard to see how that might turn out well for him. So I don't really know, but I can see why people might worry about it.
I think she will be more successful.
Well, so Xi Jinping is very interesting in this regard.
And keep continuing the system.
Xi Jinping is so preoccupied with generational issues. He has given speeches in which he says, what is the biggest problem for our nation? Young people. And he says, interestingly enough, the young people of China today. Why? Well, the first generation of revolutionaries, they fought the revolution and they won. They're loyal to the revolution. The second generation of revolutionaries, they witnessed the revolution and they were raised by the revolutionaries. They're in good shape, they're okay. But the third generation, what you do with them, that's a big question, folks, right? So Xi Jinping talks a lot about struggle, vigilance, sacrifice, national mission, rejuvenation, and talks about it in a way that he hopes will inspire young people. He encourages them to learn how to eat bitterness, to go to the countryside. But he also appreciates that consumer culture is now a big part of Chinese society. So he understands that you need to grow the economy at the same time. So he's trying to do both, and then sometimes it's a big muddle. Because pursuing vigilance and ideological orthodoxy and sacrifice, but at the same time not running the economy into the ground, it's not an easy thing to do. It's pretty hard, right? So for him, it's an existential problem. And for Chinese young people, I don't know how they feel, but it's an interesting thing to wonder about whether they want to go on the merry-go-round again of the third generation of struggle, especially after things like COVID. Right? I haven't taken polls or anything, but anecdotally, young people after COVID became a little bit more skeptical about the direction of the country. And so, what that means is, so you have this double problem, right? Succession at the top, who Xi Jinping is going to pick, whether that person likes what Xi Jinping is doing, but also how you win over the third generation. And one final anecdote about this. When Xi Jinping, his father, visited the United States in 1980, he went to Iowa, and he visited the Amana colonies. Anybody from the Midwest here? I'm from Detroit. Amana colonies were, where are you from? Amana colonies were this communist utopia that were created in Iowa. And then after 3 generations, they decided we don't want to do this anymore, and they voted not to do it. And we're going to do a Baochang, we're going to go to household responsibility system. And someone who was there when Xi Jinping visited, he said that Xi wasn't always super engaged on the trip, but when we went to Amana and the tour guide was telling the story about how communism in America decided they didn't want to be communists no more, he became super agitated. He was like asking all these questions like, well, what happened to like inequalities in society and all this kind of thing. And so the answer was that he was given, as I understand it, was like young people just like, they wanted to have fun, they wanted to date, they wanted to make money, values from outside of the society were getting in. And Wang Huning, who is the chief sort of ideologue of the Chinese regime right now, he wrote a book called America Against America, and he talks about the Amana colonies, and he says exactly the same thing, which is that the problem is they couldn't win over the third generation. It was because it was outside values, and it was losing the sense of dedication, losing the sense of idealism. They're like, yeah, the economy, because it was collective, there were some like lazy people, and that wasn't good. But it was all about ideas. It was all about
Thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask 2 questions. First of all, what is the role of the military structures, of the actual military structures, of the army in these processes?
Yeah.
And second, why don't these systems usually transform into dynastic monarchies, such as North Korea?
Yeah.
Because it clearly seems like the safest way of succession.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was just talking about how Xi Jinping is all preoccupied with the third generation and how you have a successful handoff. North Korea did it. They pulled it off. They have Kim Jong-un, who is the third generation. He's 41 years old. And it looks like they're pretty secure. So there's a lot of tensions in the North Korea-China relationship for reasons we don't have to get into right now. But there have been interesting counterfactuals in the China case, right? Which is that if Mao's son hadn't been killed in, ironically, the Korean War, that Mao would have handed it off to him. And that Mao considered giving the reins to Jiang Qing, seriously considered it, but then decided for various reasons not to do that. But near his death, it does seem that Mao hoped that Hua Guofeng would not necessarily be the successor because Mao would have enough time to empower Mao Yuanqing, who was his nephew, right? So, family is family. Family you can trust. There's interesting evidence that Xi Jinping is empowering Peng Liyuan, his wife, especially in the anti-corruption campaign. because she was a PLA singer and she went to a lot of banquets and she knows a lot of secrets about these folk. And, family trust, but there's no obvious sign that Xi Jinping is looking to a son. And I think that even in a really leader-friendly system to do something quite that brazen, he would need a lot of prep work. But then again, I think he might be able to pull it off, but I don't know. In terms of the military, there's lots of different examples of the military and the roles that it played, but as I was saying, it's really the final guarantor of power in these types of systems, but that it's not the military fighting against the party. It tends to be which party member has the best relationship with the military and can use them effectively. And so Deng, his only formal position in the 1980s was head of the Central Military Commission. He wasn't head of the party, Hu Yaobang was. And so that also led to a lot of confusion and problems. And Xi Jinping now, people keep saying, well, is his position strong? In the military, he has to keep purging people, and why would he purge people who are the closest to him? I think there's one answer to that is, it's precisely because you're close to Xi Jinping that you need to be the most careful, right? And for Xi Jinping, it's when those people who are closest to him that screw up that is the most upsetting and can contribute to increasingly dark views of his situation. But there's also this idea that I think is inherently, or maybe kind of Leninist, which Amir can talk about more eloquently than me, which is that there's no equilibrium, there's no stasis. You never purge enough people that you're done. And the reason for that is there's this idea that the better you do, the more conceited you become, the more self-satisfied you become, and then you're more vulnerable to making mistakes, like becoming corrupt. And the other problem is that the enemy, the United States, they become increasingly brazen the better you do because they're more scared of you, so they go after people within your elite. Keep in mind, when Xi Jinping first came to power, one of the first things he learned was that there was a huge penetration by American intelligence services of the Chinese regime. And he seems to think about that kind of problem as connected to two other problems. One is his view, and he's expressed this in internal speeches that leaked out, that the final guarantor of Chinese power and the reason the party survived is that the military always did the right thing at the right moment, which I can talk about. And second, that lack of ideals and corruption makes you vulnerable to that penetration, and that if you're too materialistic and you're not gung-ho with the idea of the party, it's hard to ask them to kill for you. And one final note on this, when people first started to worry about Xi Jinping and think he was going to be more conservative than people thought he was, one was I already mentioned, he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was about losing control of their history and ideology. What was the second reason? They lost control of their military. And he said it in this very gendered language that no real man stepped forward. And obviously he was talking to people within the Chinese elite that if you come after me, folks, I'm going to be a real man, and I am going to use the military to fight and save the regime.
Thank you. A short question. Your next book used the title of Party's Interest Come First. So when in 1976, when Wang Dongxing, Hua Guofeng, and other guys, Ye Jianying, make the decision of overthrowing the party, a gang of four, which interest come first? The party's interest or their own personal interest, or they combine together?
I think they thought they were saving the party. Now, you might say, well, that's me saying nice things about old communists, but let me tell you why I think that. 1978, 1979, 1980, as I said, Hua Guofeng was more popular in the party than people think. Peng Zhen warned him, Deng is coming for you. Ye Jianying, should we do another smashing of the Gang of Four, meaning, do you want me to arrest Deng Xiaoping? Even Wang Zhen, seen as this Deng ally, he warned Hua Guofeng about what Deng was doing. And so Hua was the leader of the party. That really means something. It means a lot. So if he wanted to fight back, he had some dry gunpowder if he wanted to. But he didn't. Why didn't he? Because he said the party has already suffered enough with these power struggles that keep happening over and over and over again. And I'm going to put the party's interests first. And so these are some like tough, violent, mean folk. But there was an idealism there that wasn't totally a joke for them either, that I think explains some of this. So like I said, you're having a power struggle, but you also are doing it in the context of an organization to which you are very loyal, which is why I call it sort of a knife fight with weird wolves that requires some planning.
Thank you so much, Joseph.
Great, thank you.